Just wait for them to. Right, just wait to sort of, as Adam said, about 30 seconds or so for people to filter in, then we'll get started. 2 so far. Okay. Right, it seems like we've got a decent number in now, and so, Adam, can you hide everyone else's video boxes, please?
It's done. The broadcast that's going out only has you two on it.
Okay, great. So yes, we're here with Lord Paul Boateng, member of the realm, former cabinet minister, sort of civil rights activist, barrister, who's here to have a conversation event with. This has been organised by the Young Fabians BAME Advocacy Group, which is ably chaired by Henry and Angie. And they are sort of largely responsible for organising tonight's event. All I've had to do is sort of come up with a list of questions, which isn't going to cause a massive Twitter storm, essentially. So if you're happy to get straight into it, go on to the first question. So relatively sort of simple one, but having sort of done some like very basic research, you yourself came from a sort of quite a political family. But when did you yourself actually become interested in politics, sort of separately from sort of it being something your father did?
I was brought up in a political family, and it wasn't just my dad, it was my mum too. They were activists in the movement for colonial freedom. I spent my childhood, first of all in the colony, the Gold Coast, and then in Ghana. We were surrounded by politics. So there never was a sort of a moment when I said, politics is for me. In my family, you didn't have any option other than to be political. You know, I went with my dad on a regular basis to see W.E.B. Du Bois, who was his friend. This is the great African-American philosopher and founder of the Encyclopedia Africana. When I was 9, Oliver Tambo and Adelaide Tambo came and stayed at the house in Ghana when they were deployed by Nelson Mandela to go abroad and to found the ANC. You know, my dad would return as a lawyer before he became a minister. He was a lawyer for the Freedom Party, for the Convention People's Party. He would come back from the assizes up country where he had been working in areas controlled by those who were opposed to Freedom Now. He would come back with bullet holes in his car. So, you know, this is not the sort of family where you are not political. And when ultimately there was a coup d'etat inspired and funded by the CIA, my dad was flung into prison without trial, held there indefinitely for more than 4 years. We had to flee the country with 2 suitcases. We ended up in a place called Hemel Hempstead in a new town, where my mum was lucky enough to get a job as a teacher. And with the teacher came a home, because we had nothing in the UK. I joined the Young Socialists when I was 15. So, you know, that was life. And in 1966, in the UK, you know, what mattered to young people was the Vietnam War. What mattered was the struggle against apartheid, against racism. What mattered was were the events of 1968. This was a highly, highly political time.
So yeah, that brings us sort of neatly on to so my next question. So what actually sort of motivated you from going from that sort of quite broad interest in a number of sort of political issues to sort of specifically joining the Labour Party and getting involved at that level? Was it just, did you see as of a natural continuation of sort of the various sort of campaigning sort of issues you're involved in, or was what motivated you?
I think, I went to a grammar school on a council estate in Hemel Hempstead. And if you were a teenager in 1966 in the UK, and you went to a school like that, in a place like that, there was a lot going on. We had a chairman of the school governing body who was a strong supporter of debating. And once a month on a Friday night, in a room above a pub in the old High Street in Hemel Hempstead, there would be debates between young conservatives and young socialists. And, young people were political, and we were arguing, and we were contesting for the sort of society that we wanted to live in. And as a young black guy, the only black guy in the school, as a refugee, I'll not forget, my first moments at that school. My headmaster was a great guy called VJ Wrigley, and on my first day at school, he took me into his study, and he said, "Look, I really want you to feel at home here, but I want you to make a contribution. So come with me, get into your whites." And I thought to myself, well, what does he mean, get into my whites? But it was then explained that it was my first day. My form was out on the cricket field, and I was expected to get ready to play cricket. Now, I did as I was told. I walked out with the headmaster onto the cricket field, and the headmaster turned to all these guys there and said, "Look, this is Boateng. Here's the reason why we're going to win the county cricket championships this year." Now, I was somewhat taken aback at this, but it was then clear that he somehow got the idea that I was from Guyana in the West Indies and not Ghana in West Africa. In Ghana, we don't play cricket. We play football, as anyone that follows football today will know by the number of Ghanaian players out there. So I had no idea about cricket. So I'm afraid I let the side down on cricket, but it became very clear that I did actually, I had the gift of the gab. I was able to talk. I was interested in ideas and in politics, and I became captain very quickly of the school debating team. And we did win a county prize that year. But for me, that was the spoken word and argument and contention was my way of surviving and moving from survival to some form of success. So that's what I did, and that's what happened. And that year I won the English-speaking Union county competition together with a guy who became a mate for life, Chris Cushion. And I never really looked back after that. And indeed, in due course, many, many, many years later, I became chairman of the English-speaking Union of the Commonwealth. But, it was, you just had to make your way. You had to find your way. And that's what I tried to do.
I mean, I should sort of say my grandmother was from Guyana, so I sort of appreciate how often that comes up. But this is sort of lead on to the other subject I want to talk about from earlier. The sort of idea of having moved back to Ghana, or having moved to Ghana at 4, then moved back to the UK at 15. The idea of sort of culture shock and sort of not sort of perhaps feeling a bit sort of not out of your depth, but sort of in an unusual situation. And sort of certainly I know what it's like to be the only sort of non-white kid in my sort of year at school, and sort of experiencing sort of a certain level of sort of racism and sort of discrimination, just casual racism. So
I was very lucky. I was very lucky, Leon. I never experienced any racism at school. But I never forget, and you know, I had cause many years later to make this point to him directly. But on the day after Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, on the very day after, I was walking back from school in Bennett's End when someone drove by in a van and shouted the N-word at me and asked me why I didn't go home. The very day after Enoch Powell made that speech. So, you know, racism was alive and well, and racism was brought to the fore and given respectability by that speech. And many years later, I had an opportunity to challenge Powell on that on TV, and I did because, you know, the impact of racism on children and on young people is very real. And yes, it's racism is a fact of life. Was a fact of life then, is a fact of life now. It takes different forms. We've made some progress, but equally it's there. And the race disparity audit reveals that very clearly. That if you are Black, you're more likely to be arrested. You're more likely to be held in secure wards in a mental hospital. You are less likely to get a job, even if you've got the same qualifications. All those depressing, debilitating statistics remain and continue to scar our national lives and the lives of countless young people and people of all ages all their lives. That's part of our reality, which is why we have to continue to be vigilant in the struggle against racism.
Hey, I think that's a very true, relevant statement, especially at the moment. I have realised I missed out one bit of housekeeping when we first started. At the bottom of your screen, for people who are watching this on Zoom, there should be a Q&A button. So just while we're talking now, if you have any questions you'd like to be asked, if you can just enter them in there, and Henry and Andrew will have a look through and feed us perhaps the most interesting ones. But now if we can just move on from racism in the country to racism in the Labour Party, and specifically discrimination against Black people. I think it's fair to say that even today there can be a slight resistance to, or it can be a sense the Labour Party is very happy to have Black activists, but there can then be some resistance when Black activists want to take on elected position or go for public office. I just wanted to ask you about what was your experience of that, or did you experience it all from when you joined, going through university and then during your early career?
When at every stage in my career as a lawyer, in every stage of my life as an activist and a politician, of course, you have had to break through glass ceilings. That's just the reality. Systemic racism in the law and in politics was and remains, to a certain extent, a fact of life. So when I started practice as a solicitor in London, there were just two really active legal aid solicitors operating in the whole of London. Myself and a guy called Colin Bob Semple. That was the reality. And of course, you faced that when you went into court. You had to, when you went into a police station, you had to establish your authority and your position as an advocate for a client very quickly, very early on. if you were to do the best by your client. And you learn to live with that. And the only way you could succeed was by working twice as hard and being twice as good and establishing a reputation as someone who was competent, who was a fighter, who would go the extra mile. That's what you had to do as a lawyer. But also, and importantly, you had to form alliances. You had to make friends. You had to establish professional relationships that were good and positive ones. You had to build your relationship with the community, because nobody ever achieves anything on their own. You achieve most when you work with others, and when you respect others and respect what they bring to the table. And I had to do that, and one has to do that in the law. But in politics, the reality was that the alliances that you had to form were alliances, first and foremost, with your fellow party members of all backgrounds and of all races, and then importantly and critically with the wider community of activists and with the electorate. What we didn't have in the Labour Party was a leadership who were committed in any sense to the autonomous self-organization of Black people within the party. On the contrary, the Black Sections movement, which is what helped us make the breakthrough within the party in terms of increasing the number of Black people who were elected to office within the party, who became councillors, who became members of parliament. The Black Section movement was fought tooth and nail by the leadership of the Labour Party, and indeed by the leadership of sections of the trade union movement. So we had to make and form alliances, and that's what we did. And it was that brought about the breakthrough within the party. The Labour leadership never woke up one morning, looked in the mirror and said, wouldn't it be nice to have Black MPs? That's not how it worked. So it was Black people and white people. It was trade unionists. It was activists within the party coming together and saying enough is enough. We can no longer tolerate a situation in which our party actually does not represent, in terms of its leadership, in terms of its elected representatives, the community to whom it turns to for votes, to whom it looks for support, which it purports to represent in terms of the equality and justice agenda. But it was a hard-fought political battle. And we have to be very clear about the importance of grassroots organization. There's no substitute for it. You know, the great American orator and freedom fighter who was born a slave, Frederick Douglass, he said this: power concedes nothing without a demand. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. That's as true today as it ever was.
You've talked quite a bit about sort of the opposition from leadership there and the importance of grassroots organising, but from what I've sort of read in the past, of the sort of 12 BAME candidates who were running for Parliament in 1987, a number of them did actually report of quite a sort of, after they were selected, did report quite a substantial amount of opposition from the grassroots, so from local constituency parties in the seats they were standing in, who essentially didn't want a Black MP or didn't want a sort of brown MP to sort of represent them. And I just want to ask, like, so after you were selected in Brent South, was the constituency party sort of cooperative, or was there sort of opposition or sort of some holdouts? Or
the constituency party in Brent South supported me all my political life, and I am hugely grateful to them. I remember fighting the general election of 1983, and I fought the general election of 1983 in a seat called Hemel Hempstead. And there it was very tough. The party was divided. There were undoubtedly those who were opposed to me. They thought I was too much on the left. There was undoubtedly also a racial element amongst and within the community. There was undoubtedly an element of racism. We found that on the doorstep. And I'll never forget one particular wet Saturday afternoon in a place called Tring. We were knocking on doors in Tring, and we'd had a very, very tough reception. And some people had come up from Brent, actually, and they knocked on doors with me, and they knew that we weren't going to win. I mean, the 83 was a very difficult election for Labour everywhere. We experienced setbacks everywhere. And after we'd had this difficult day, I remember two of them in particular, Cedric Best and Mike Maguire, both now actually no longer with us. And they said to me, "Paul, you've had a tough day. We don't think you're going to win this seat, but our MP is going to retire. And I promise you, you will never go through this again." And those two people were as good as their word. And they formed a broad-based coalition of Asians, of blacks, of white people, left of center, right, within Brent South. And they chose me as their candidate, and the whole party united behind my candidacy. And so, I was very, very fortunate. But that's not to say that we didn't have our struggles. And I give you one example of them, and it just shows you how the nature of politics at the time. I was asked to go to South Africa and to work with Archbishop Desmond Tutu during the state of emergency. And I went there under the auspices of the World Council of Churches. Whilst I was there, the Bureau of State Security, knowing I was there, somehow managed to get a handful of people in my constituency to move a motion of no confidence in myself on the basis that I had broken an embargo on travel to South Africa. And they managed to get a headline in a publication called The Voice, which at that time was the major black publication in the UK, to that effect. So it was a concerted attempt to destabilize me as a member of Parliament in that visit in 1988, to say I was going to be deselected. Of course, they had no support within the constituency, and Oliver Tambo put out a statement saying that I had gone to South Africa at the request of the ANC, which was the truth, and it fell away. But they did manage, the South Africans did manage to find a handful of people who were prepared within the party to make trouble and to act as dupes, essentially, for the apartheid regime. So no, it wasn't and hasn't been, I think, for anyone at that time, all plain sailing, far from it. It was a constant struggle. The hate mail, the disinformation, the slurs, they were part and parcel, and are part and parcel of what every black politician has to go through. And listening to some of my younger colleagues today, of course, we didn't have social media then, but listening to some of my younger colleagues today, it's very clear that they are experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I did, first part of the research for this event, I was reading a piece in the House magazine that you and a number of our sort of BAME parliamentarians contributed to recently. And I think one of the things I sort of noticed compared to that sort of trio of BAME MPs who were elected in 1987 was, sorry, I'm losing that, is that you didn't sort of experience any sort of pushback or sort of hostility from sort of fellow parliamentarians or from the House of Commons staff. I just wanted to ask, like, what had your expectation been before you entered Parliament? Was it a case of you were expecting sort of Parliament to be like a sort of very sort of traditional sort of, well, I mean, it is a very traditional institution, but sort of want to be hostile to people who are coming in, or were you just sort of quite...
Leon, I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I've grown up in the law, and I expected and I found Parliament to be and the experience of Parliament in many ways to be very similar to my experience of courts up and down the country. And my approach actually was very similar too. As a young lawyer, I spent a lot of time going to court and just listening and watching and learning. I would always go to court very early on in the morning and talk to the court staff, learn about the court, learn about the tribunal, which I was to appear before, because I knew that I was going to have a mountain to climb, and I sought to prepare myself accordingly. And I had the same approach really to Parliament. I did not expect it to be easy. It wasn't easy. And I spent a lot of time learning, listening, getting to know people, because that's the way I felt I could best represent my constituents. And that's what I tried to do. For me, being a parliamentarian has always been about my constituents. I never saw, I'm a lawyer by profession. I never saw politics as a career, actually, and I still don't. I'm an activist. And as an activist, I got into politics not because I wanted to be an MP. I got into politics because I could no longer tolerate a situation in which I felt the community which I was a part of, and very many of my clients, frankly, were disrespected and let down by the political system. And I felt that I didn't want to spend my whole life having to deal with that in a court of law. I wanted to get in there and to change the place, and to change where the laws were made, and to change the laws themselves. And to do that, I had to become a member of Parliament. To do that, I had to become a councillor. I mean, I can remember the very moment that I decided I was going to become a councillor. And it was as a result of the way in which a particular group of people, and there's a group of Black women from Lewisham, who founded something called the Scrap Sus campaign against the Vagrancy Act, which was a law used disproportionately against Black youth. And these women, I never forget going to represent them, with them, to represent them to a group of councillors. And they were Labour councillors. They were all white, and frankly, they were disrespectful of those women. And I felt it was wrong. And I looked at them and I thought, well, look, I've been a member of this party since I was 15 years of age. That's when I joined the Labour Party, Young Socialists. I'm not prepared. And to put up with this. And so I became a counsellor. And then on the GLC, which is an exciting and formative period of my life. And then I was approached by a number of constituencies to stand for Parliament, but it was never any part of a sort of a career plan. You know, I'm an activist and a lawyer, and everything has flowed from that.
I think if we can move on to the sort of modern Black Lives Matter movement now, and you mentioned the Stop the Sus campaign, which obviously you was, I believe, the in-house solicitor for.
Yes, one way. That's one way of describing it. I was their legal advisor, but yeah, in-house solicitor. That's a good way of putting it.
So I want to ask, like, sort of how, like, what differences do you think there are between the sort of the modern Black Lives Matter movement and the sort of collection of sort of civil rights campaigns and the outpourings of anger, so the sort of various riots in Brixton back in the 80s?
First of all, Leon, we saw them as uprisings. You know, what happened in Bristol, what happened in Toxteth, what happened in Brixton, in Tottenham, in Birmingham, and we saw them as uprisings because this was disaffected and alienated, largely Black youth saying enough is enough to police oppression, to the lack of opportunity, to the discrimination, to all the stuff they'd seen their parents have to put up with. And when I compare that to the Black Lives Movement, one of the first things that strikes me most powerfully is the way in which the Black Lives Movement is so multiracial. You know, it's so much a whole generation saying enough is enough. We cannot any longer be complicit in this. We're not prepared to put up with this. We're not prepared to put up with all that we see around us. And it's so much more broadly based. So I think this is a critical moment. It's a kairos moment, a moment, a real opportunity to make a breakthrough, because what's so dispiriting, frankly, for someone of my age and generation is the extent to which, and I referred to it earlier on, the racial disadvantage and disparity is embedded and institutionalized in our society. That's not to say we haven't made real gains. I mean, we have, undoubtedly. Certainly we've seen the face of Parliament and of politics and of government transformed in some ways. But the underlying experience of Black and ethnic minority peoples, which has been revealed starkly by the inequalities in health outcomes, the inequalities in health opportunities within our society as a whole, the inequalities in terms of the way in which frontline workers are underpaid and undervalued, and the number of those frontline workers who are Black and ethnic minority Brits, the stark disparities require a concerted response. And I'm full of respect for the Black Lives Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and the young people who have taken to the streets and protested in the way that they have. And I only hope that civic and corporate Britain responds with more than lip service. Certainly there has been a quite remarkable response in terms of declarations that certainly we never got after the events of 1980 and 81. You know, we had the Scarman report and we had the Macpherson report. They were important steps forward important recommendations, but clearly they weren't acted upon in the way that they should have been. Clearly, the very best efforts of those who came after them, including my own government and the government in which I was a part, we clearly were not able to deliver the sort of systemic change that must now happen. And the Black Lives Matter movement is driving that forward with an energy and a commitment that demands respect.
So this, I know this still might be a difficult question because sort of traditionally predicting the future has been a bit of a fool's game, but how likely do you think it is that Black Lives Matter movement will sort of achieve some sort of lasting result? Or sort of a significant lasting result, to be more specific?
I think what makes it more likely than previous movements in the past is the breadth of its base. And the numbers of people of so many different races and backgrounds who are part of it. But also, you know, Leon, the imperative, if this country is to not just survive, but to go forward, the imperative of ending the waste that is racism. I mean, racism is an evil. It's a sin. Racism is a crime, but it's also a terrible waste. It's a waste of potential. It deprives the nation and the world of so much talent and so much opportunity that there is a strong rational case, as well as a spiritual and emotional, moral and ethical case for defeating it. No company, no British company can hope to succeed in our world if it is a company that does not have Black people, that doesn't have minority, a BAME presence, that doesn't have a gender, a degree of gender equality and fairness and justice at its heart. I mean, the numbers still of boards, corporate boards in the UK that don't have a single Black or minority ethnic member on the board, that have maybe one or at most two, if you look at the FTSE 100 companies, women on the board. You know, if they believe that they are going to succeed in the world as it is today, they are sorely mistaken. You know, the scandal, frankly, of Public Health England. If you look at Public Health England and the gross underrepresentation of the BAME community in Public Health England, you understand why it has not been the most effective of bodies in responding to COVID-19. And if you look and you listen to what NHS clinicians and staff are telling us about their experience as BAME members of the NHS and the failure of management to address their concerns, then you see that there's a strong public health case for addressing the issue of racial inequality and racism within the healthcare system. So all of that demands that we have to move from rhetoric to action, and the consequences of not doing so will literally be fatal. Fatal for the economy, fatal for Britain's place in the world, but also quite literally fatal.
Right. I'll just move on to sort of last question before we open up to questions from the audience. This is just something I want to ask with regards to the recent passing of John Lewis. The recent passing of John Lewis. This is a question sort of relating to the recent passing of John Lewis.
Yes.
How important do you think it is to sort of have sort of people from previous generations of sort of civil rights campaigners and campaigns sort of in the room with these new movements. So not necessarily sort of, the last generation always retaining control, but certainly.
Thanks, Leon. The older I get, the more important I think it becomes. But joking apart, I mean, I knew Congressman Lewis. I knew Congressman Dellums. I know and remain in contact with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. They all came and were with us in and at the GLC in the 80s. And they were great and inspirational figures then. I mean, we'll never forget in Harlesden, in my old constituency, when Jesse Jackson came to Harlesden. People talk about it to this day. So that generation are huge, of men and women are hugely significant. They have been all my life. I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, my dad was a friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. I sang at W.E. Du Bois's funeral because he left America and came to live in Ghana, and I was in the choir at his funeral. And these were and are great and inspirational figures. Paul Robeson, if you just, quite apart from being a great artist and a great actor, if you read his life story and the sacrifices he made for the civil rights movement, for working people the world over. I mean, there are still people alive today in the Welsh valleys, miners. At one stage, I was a lawyer for the National Union of Miners. And of course, in the 80s, there were many more people alive who remembered hearing Paul Robeson in concert. And I remember meeting some of those. These were the lives and memory of these men and women are very, very precious. And we have some of our own. I mean, I think of Paul Stevenson in Bristol, who's still alive. A bit frail, Paul, aren't you? But you're still alive, very much alive. And he led the bus boycott in Bristol in the 60s that desegregated the bus companies in Bristol. Because we had segregation in this country too, Don't forget, there were dockers who marched in favor of Enoch Powell. I won't forget them. There were sections of our trade union movement which have been infiltrated by racists. I haven't forgotten that. Because my experience of racism is that racism is alive and well in both left and right. Still is, still is. And we have to be vigilant to that.
Well, thank you for being answering our questions. I'll move on now to the questions from the audience. We've got two questions which are quite similar from Jermaine Jackman and Armand Tesfaye. Henry, if you can bring up Jermaine.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Jermaine. I can hear you, but I can't see you.
That's all right. I'm not looking great this evening.
Okay.
But I guess my question to you is: since your election with Bernie Grant in 1987, there has only been 4 other Black men of African and Caribbean heritage elected to Parliament. What do you think the Labour Party needs to do to get more young Black men in positions at all levels of the party?
It has to be intentional. It has to be strategic. It has to be as intentional as the Conservative Party has been in this area. There's no excuse for not being intentional when it comes to overcoming barriers, when it comes to defeating racism. And by intentional, I mean going out and making the effort to identify, to support, to mentor, to encourage young Afro-Caribbean men to become involved in the party. There's no shortage of talent in that regard, but there are plenty of obstacles still.
Mm-hmm.
And we need the leadership and we need the grassroots together to be active, working with young Black men to overcome those.
Thank you very much.
Also should say that both Armin and Jermaine are members of an organisation known as the 1987 Caucus, an organisation set up to increase the number of Black members of who are able to advance to either hold public office or hold high positions within the Labour Party and sort of politics.
I think that's so important because it is for activists, to organize as you are clearly organizing, to bring this about and to support one another. That's what we did in the Black Sections movement. And it's just so important you're doing it today. And I very much hope that the leadership reaches out and supports you in that.
And if anyone's more interested in if anyone wants to learn more, Henry, would you be able to sort of put a link to the website in the Facebook event? And with that, on to the next question. If we could bring up Sophie Tice, who's asked a question about reforming of institutions.
Hi, Sophie.
Hiya. I was just wondering, because you've been talking a lot about kind of some institutions which just seem systematically racist, with many of its members and kind of the system itself. And so I was wondering if you think it's best to stay in such a system or organisation and kind of try and reform it on the inside, even if you disagree with it, and kind of have that conflict with representing it. Or if you think it's best to leave and try and work from the outside.
I was always brought up to hang on in there and to fight. And that's what I've done. And that's obviously what I would encourage others to do. But what I never do is to judge those who say, no, I just can't put up with it anymore. I don't judge them because I know what can be flung at you. I know what can be flung at you when you hang on in there and fight. And I never disrespect people that say, I'm not prepared to put up with that. I'm not prepared to allow my family to put up with it. I understand that. But I know what I felt I had to do and what I feel I continue to have to do. But I never disrespect those that say no. Because I cannot pretend that it's not a constant and ongoing struggle. It is. But also, my experience is that you need both sorts of folk. You need people who are prepared to hang on in there and to fight and to work from within. But you also need people who are putting the pressure on from outside. I mean, I had a great, someone I had huge sort of arguments with, and we were real sparring partners, a guy called Darcus Howe. And Darcus was a great polemicist, a great writer, a journalist, a great speaker. And he always used to say to me, Paul, you're mad being a member of the Labour Party. You need your head examining. And he would constantly, go on at me about the fact that that I was a member and I was doing what I was doing. But he was a great activist, and he was a great man. And he organized from outside, and he put pressure on the whole system. And he organized around the New Cross fire. He He formed his own television company. He made some great programs, and he was a thorn in some ways in my side, in Diane's side, in Bernie's side, in all of it, because he never really thought that that we'd made the right call in terms of joining the party. Although he came round a bit towards the end of his life, but we respected each other because we both realized that we had different but complementary roles to play. And so I think, Sophie, you make a decision and you decide where you feel you are best equipped to make a difference. But the important thing is to make a difference. And the important thing is to make common cause with others to make a difference.
Thank you so much.
So a follow-up question, I know I said I wouldn't ask any more of my own questions, but a follow-up on Sophie's. But in terms of people sort of staying and fighting, how important do you think the idea of having sort of good allies in organisations, so sort of white people who are willing to sort of stay and fight when it gets too much for sort of black people to sort of stay?
Very, because we have to live what we believe in. What I believe in a shared and common humanity. I do believe that. I myself decline. I refuse to be trapped within the castle of my skin. You have constantly to reach out to others, and you have to have, yes, a core and a real sense of your own identity. And I'm proud of my identity. I'm proud of my African identity. I'm proud of my British identity. I'm a Londoner. I am black. I am an African. I'm a Brit. I'm all those things. Identity is a complex issue. But I was always brought up by my mother and father never to allow myself to be defined by the color of my skin, and never to define other people by the color of their skin. And I still decline. I refuse to do that. But I believe strongly in our right as Black people to organize as Black people, and to organize as Black and Asian and minority ethnic people within our party and within every aspect of our society. But that doesn't mean putting barriers up against people of different races and different ethnicities and different backgrounds, different genders, different sexualities. On the contrary, it means wherever you can, making common cause.
Thank you for that. So next up, we've got a question from Carl Anderson about the current Labour front bench. If we can bring him up.
Carl.
So we'll try not to cause another controversy.
I can't see him. I can't hear him.
Yeah, it looks like we're not able to get him up for some reason. So I'll just read out his question. When you were first minister, you did an awful lot to fight the root causes of poverty affecting children both in Britain and abroad. What steps do you think the Labour front bench should be taking to hold the government to account on this increasingly growing issue?
I think the Labour front bench are doing very well. I think they're making real inroads. I think the leader of the party is clearly landing a number of very serious punches on Boris at question time, and that's his role. That's what he should be doing. I think the Labour front bench are serious and focused, and I think they need and are entitled to have our support. They are entitled to have and need our input. The responsibility for developing alternative policies doesn't rest solely with the front bench. On the contrary, it requires the sort of work that you and young Fabians and the young Fabians are doing in your policy commissions. It will require the party to get serious about policy and about shaping and developing policy, about getting out there and listening to our electorate, to all shades of opinion within our electorate, and fashioning from that a winning platform. But I think the front bench are doing a good job and have made a good start. But they require us all. You can't delegate the responsibility for the formulation and articulation of policy to leadership. We have ourselves as individuals to be prepared to knock on doors, to talk to people, to go out. I mean, one of the things I used to find very helpful and useful as a constituency MP was just going out into by the clock in Harlesden or in Wembley Town Square by the station, and with a megaphone, and just talking and answering questions and having some feedback with the people that I represented. There's no substitute for that. There must be no no-go areas for Labour. We've got to get out there, talk to the people, and deliver policies that will stand scrutiny and that will equip us to go forward and to fight and to win the next general election, as I believe we can and as I believe we will.
I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. So if we can bring up Marco Anderson, who has a question about Bristol in the 70s.
Yeah. Hi, Marco. I can hear you.
Hi. Yes. So I'm just interested because I graduated from Bristol University in 2018.
Did you?
I studied law as well, and I'm just interested to hear what your experience was, because when I went there, because my father's Cuban and my mum is British, or a mixed race, but I found myself to be one of a very small number of people who were not white, privately educated, with lots of money, and in 2018. So I'm just interested to hear what it was like when you were there in the 70s, and how much.
Very similar, Marco. very, very similar indeed. I mean, I think there were two of us in the law faculty in 1970 when I started. Myself and a guy from the Bahamas, and they couldn't have been more. If I just think about, if I would go into the Union building, if I saw 6 black people, I saw a lot. Mm. And yes, they were largely privately educated, and I was a grammar school boy from a council estate. Bristol, however, has done more than many universities actually in seeking to reach out and to conduct selection on the basis that takes into account more than just A-level grades.
Definitely. Yeah.
But like so many universities, it still has a way to go, and I think it'll own up to that fact. And I think there's a big way to go, not just in Bristol, but across the university sector, in terms of the black attainment gap, and also, and importantly, in terms of the appointment of BAME faculty. I mean, there is a disgracefully low number of BAME professors in the UK university system. And all too many, first of all, have to go to the US before coming back to the UK at professorial level. And that, frankly, is a scandal. And the sector really needs to look at itself in the mirror. And I've put down a number of questions in this regard in the House. I think the office, in the House of Lords, I think the Office of Students for students has got a job of work to do in that respect. But you know, I was president of debates when I was at Bristol, master of moots, won the Hunt Cup. So I had a on the university council. So I had a good university and good and positive university experience. But the reality is that there's still deeply ingrained patterns of disadvantage and discrimination within the university sector. And that's why I say there's no room for complacency in any area of our national life. So the struggle continues.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I've just realised, that there's another question from Jermaine Jackman we missed earlier. So if we can bring Jermaine back if he's still here and have him ask his question.
No.
Oh.
No. But I think, Leon, you know, what I'd leave you with, and I think it's particularly relevant to you as young Fabians, in every area of policy, as you examine it, to remember those words of Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And I think young Fabians are ideally placed to make that demand and to make yourself heard within the party and within the country and beyond.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think if we can stop it there, Lord Paul Boateng, everyone. And we'll contact a round of applause.
Leon, you know, all the best to you, to Anjali, to Henry, to Adam. You know, good luck.
Thank you.
And I think, you know, for all of us in the party, as we work for government, because that's what we have to do, for all of us and for our country and for the wider world, the best is yet to come. Good luck.
Thank you.